Hi, Fond Me has asked me a question as to whether observing the Saturday Sabbath makes you a cult, makes you part of a cult, and the church you attend a cult. There's a couple of issues here. Firstly, obviously identifying what a cult is from the Christian church, and whether a cult is indeed, you could say, an established cult group, which is commonly identified as the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, the Mormons, Christian Science, and you have to also understand what you mean by the word cult, because a lot of people would get offended by the term cult, saying your church is a cult, your group is a cult. Walter Martin, in many of his talks, quotes the same. A cult is a group of people who are polarized around a doctrine or a particular person and their teachings. The word cult comes from the word cultus. It is Latin, which means to worship. So it could be said that Christianity is a cult, to Judaism is a cult. You can class any religion as a cult. There are many cults out there, different types of cults, but the question on this aspect is whether Saturday worship, having the Saturday Sabbath, makes you a cult. I would say the answer to that is no, and no more than having Sunday as the Sabbath day means you have the mark of the beast, as the Seventh-day Adventists and certain other groups have actually said in their histories and their writings. If we could turn to that verse, particularly on this aspect of how the Christian church began to worship on a Sunday and have that as the Sabbath day rather than the Saturday. Historically, the Christian church has always observed a Sabbath day. It was primarily the Saturday Sabbath, and it was the Saturday Sabbath for this reason. The Jews who had converted to Christianity and then wished to pass on the good news to their fellow Jews would go to the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath they would go into the synagogue, and there they would speak to other Jews who also were not working at the time because they were observing the Sabbath, and they would be gathering to discuss theological issues, and was an ideal ground for spreading the good news of Jesus Christ, because the prophets were being discussed. But the Sabbath laws were a part of the law of Moses, and nowhere in the New Testament is the Christian church commanded to obey the Sabbath laws and to observe the Saturday Sabbath. Now, Seventh-day Adventists will say that's not actually accurate, and when you quote the passage, which is clearly says that one should not judge or be judged on what day you worship on what Sabbath you observe. Okay, they will say, well, that's referring to festivals. It's not referring to the Sabbath of the Saturday. In Leviticus 23, where these laws are and these festivals are brought up, they did actually incorporate the Sabbath day, the Saturday Sabbath, as part of these festivals. So if Jesus fulfilled these festivals, then they also would have fulfilled the Sabbath day part of the festival as well. And you also have to take into account that when the Gentiles began accepting the gospel, and in Acts 15 Paul presented his case to the council in Jerusalem, the Pharisees who had believed in the gospel turned up and said we should be encouraging the Gentiles to be circumcised and to be obeying the law of Moses, to observing the law of Moses. And after prayer and discussion, James gave the judgment, said basically, why should we burden these Gentiles with the same burden that we had and we couldn't keep? And he gave a list of what Gentile Christians should observe: fornication, things that being devoted to idols, etc. Nowhere was the Gentile church, which has been the mainstay, the majority of the Christian church ever since, more than the Jews, nowhere were we commanded by the apostles or Jesus Christ himself to observe the Saturday Sabbath and to observe the Saturday laws. The historical Christian church, if I just mention a few names, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, Justin Martyr, you've got Irenaeus, Badarium, Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage. All these early church fathers identified the Lord's Day as being Sunday and being the day that Christians would meet. Even in Acts 20, we have recorded that the Christians gathered together on the first day and broke bread, held communion. With that, and put against the verse in Colossians, you see that the Sabbath laws, as part of the law of Moses, were not essential for the Christian church. The observance of them were not essential for the Christian church and for Christians in order for them to live out and work out their salvations. The salvation as quantified by Hebrews chapter 9, I think it is. Hebrews 4 verse 9 to 11 emphasize the fact that the Sabbath is the relationship between us and Jesus Christ. It's a Sabbath rest. Indeed, even in the Old Testament, in Exodus, yes, it says, remember, on the Sabbath day the Lord rested. In Deuteronomy, it says, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, and that's when the Lord brought us out. The Sabbath there and the obedience that he called upon for the Jews to obey the Sabbath was based upon the fact that God called them out of slavery. It was the one day in the week they would do no work, and God would provide for them and for their needs. So it's a big difference to look upon it. But just as we should not judge the Seventh-day Adventists because they feel they want to worship on a Saturday. God bless them. You should not judge them and label them a cult. It's when the desire to have people observe this as though it were a law, and then to start bringing in laws which add a burden and which are in addition to the grace that has been given to us by Jesus Christ. That's when you are effectively adding to the gospel, and that is when the observance of the old Mosaic law cease from being choices that we make and maybe tugs on our hearts by God, but become law and in addition to the grace of Jesus Christ which he has given. And that's cultic tendencies.